Ladies and gentlemen, we have on this panel two of the most energetic and wide-ranging historians you're ever likely to encounter. Sanjeev and Peter have both been...
You mean three?
I'm more of the... I'm in contrast to them and the sort of historian that sits writing about the same thing book after book. I've written 4 books successively on the East India Company and haven't left my closely guarded castle. While these two have ranged over desert steppes and billowing oceans to gather their materials from distant quarters, which of course leaves them both vulnerable to their attacks from critical pirates. And it is extremely brave for any historian to do that, to break out of a speciality and to write over centuries and vast areas. But they have both done it with enormous success and huge sales for both of them, though I think Sanjeev and I have to sadly look with envy and grinding teeth at the 2.5 million copies that the Silk Roads has sold so far. But we'll get there. We'll get there soon. But for all their similarities, interesting and important differences that we can explore in the course of the next 40 minutes, because Sanjeev has pioneered for India the sort of studies that are now very popular over a whole range of issues about ocean studies, about sea, the maritime, and the often forgotten, in the case of India, way that Indian sea power and Indian traders and Indian migrants and merchants have moved backwards and forwards. It's part of the extraordinary geography of India, that the way that the Tibetan plateau heats up and cools with the different seasons produces the monsoon winds, which has meant that for Indian sailors, they only have to put up a sail and they sail in one direction for one part of the year and they sail back in the other. So it's very easy, in a sense, throughout history for Indian sailors to go where few others have gone. Peter, meanwhile, has rediscovered for us the extraordinary forgotten centrality of Central Asia and Persia, as well as extending out, before he corrects me.
Can we well, it depends how you want to do this. And you're the maestro. No one forgot it. Europeans forgot it. That's something very different. And I think, well, we're going to talk about it, but no one talks about land routes versus sea routes. There's connections, and the ways of moving ideas, languages, genetics. There's no either or. And it can be dangerous.
Obviously, it's both and that, in a sense, is interesting. But where they intersect, your focus has been on the landlocked
the forgetting
portions
speaks of European empires and of the triumph of the West. And I think one has to insert that at the beginning, and very carefully and mindfully, that what we're talking about are worlds that have been deeply, intimately connected. It's the way they've been overwritten by lots of things. Classical studies, whatever that might mean, Latin and Greek. There are all sorts of good reasons for it, but I think it's the rediscovery by Western scholarship. It means something very different, that we need to be careful not to over-prioritize Eurocentrism, even in the way in which we frame these discussions.
Did you feel, Sanjeev, that you were moving back a history which into the center stage, which had been placed in the periphery by European historians?
Well, it is true that what happens is that the history of India as a maritime country is almost entirely excluded from the conversation in the reconstruction of Indian history in the 19th century by European historians. That is indeed true. But let me also say that this is not to excuse the fact that we have been free for 75 years, and it required an economist with no training in history at all to go and actually digging into this. Now, this is not to suggest that a few historians had not looked into it. There are Neelkant Shastri, for example, who does write a little bit about the maritime history.
Himanshu Prabharai.
Yeah. But the thing that I found about them, and this is where, and there are people in Indonesia, for example, who have done it. The thing was that they all looked at it from purely as if they were doing their little bit. So I found it very unsatisfactory, because this is a network. And so you actually have to read Southeast Asian history at the same time you're reading Indian history, and you have to read Omani history at the same time. And then it begins to all make sense. And for some reason, this was not being done. Now, as I said, There may be, the foundation of it may be Eurocentrism. But as I said, European empires have been gone for a long time, and it is necessary for people in the Indian Ocean region, for example, to get on with it. I mean, you can't keep blaming that at some point in time somebody did something.
What I think we'll do then is, if Sanjeev sets off and gives us a brief portrait of the ocean of churn, we'll then turn to Peter for a synopsis, a brief slither, a soupçon of the enormous bulk that is the Silk Roads. And we'll then let the two of them take their opposite corners and see what happens.
Thank you, William. What I'm going to say firstly is a very basic thing, that there is an assumption, because human beings evolved as a terrestrial animal, to think that we came to the maritime life at a very late stage. That's actually not true. For example, human beings got out of Africa, walked through across the Indian subcontinent, walked through much of Southeast Asia, which, by the way, sea levels were very low when they were migrating out of Africa, and they got somewhere in the region of Bali. But then they had to make their way across to Australia, and they did. I mean, by 12,000, at least the latest 12,000 years before now, they were populating Australia, and clearly they had to do the last bit, because there's something called the Valence line, which always had sea. And
am I right in thinking that Homo sapiens made that leap, but that Neanderthals and earlier hominids didn't?
As far as we know, Denisovans did get all the way to Southeast Asia, but it's Homo sapiens that made the leap to Australia, and of course they did a lot of damage there. As they do. The sort of so-called pristine landscape of Australia is at least in part due to human intervention. But for our purposes here, just to make the point, whether it's in rafts or boats or whatever it is, they did make the jump from Australia to, from Indonesia to Australia at some point in time. So at least 12,000 years ago, they were able to do over-the-horizon navigation, which we assume they couldn't. And so in the Indian Ocean world, at least, which is what I have studied, you find that there's a lot of maritime trade happening very early on. So again, we think of the Harappan civilization, for example, as being largely landlocked because, Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, etc., are inland. But that again misses the point that much of their relationships with the rest of the world were actually maritime. So let me just give you an example of this. Again, the landscape was very different. So you have to think of Gujarat, not the way it looks today, but you see the peninsula of Saurashtra, for example, was an island, because the sea levels at this stage were actually higher than where they are now. And what is now the Run of Kutch, which is the salt flats, were actually the estuaries of two major rivers. One was the Indus, which used to flow into the sea somewhat east of where it does today, and did so till the 19th century. And the Saraswati, which is now dried. So you have this estuary, which would have looked somewhat like what the Sundarban mangroves look like today. And there were major ports.
The Run of Kutch would have been like the Sundarbans.
Yes, they would have looked, because it was wetter. First of all, west of India was much wetter.
So salt flats today, jungle then.
Jungle then. All these islands that we now go to, Khadir Island, for example, where Dholavira is actually an island. And we go there, if you go to Khadir Island, where Dholavira is today, it's in the salt flats. It looks like there's nothing there. Why would any human being even want to get to that place? Because there's no water, there's nothing. But in fact, that's not the way to think about it. It's a large site, which is about, it's a Bronze Age site, was settled at least by 4000 BC. But why would anybody go there? Because it is surrounded by water. It's got water itself, it's forested, and it's essentially a port. So what are these people doing? They're basically using this port, and there were many such ports there, and they were sailing south and sailing west. So those who were sailing south would head down what is now the Konkan coast. Now there is, along the way, what is acknowledged to be a port called Lothal, which has a dry docks and so on, and every kid growing up in India reads it in a textbook, Lothal is a port. Lothal is not actually a port. It is a customs depot. So what's happening is ships going in and out to the Konkan have to stop at Lothal. Lothal, by the way, is also inland now far away from the sea. And they're stopping there and getting their goods checked. So if you go to you'll see a large sort of dry docks kind of place, and there are these platforms, and you can imagine a somewhat corrupt customs officers sitting there looking at the goods and giving them, putting their seals on the goods. Yeah, seals to say checked or not checked. And this was for going south. And there is similarly going westward, they would have to go past a place called Bet Dwarka. Now, Dwarka literally means the gateway. Yeah? So, gateway to what? Gateway to basically go to the Persian Gulf. And you find in Oman, in Bahrain, and all the way to Mesopotamia, all these Harappan seals, weights and measures, beads, and so on. And also in Sumerian texts, they talk about these people coming from the east called the Meluhans, who are coming there to trade in things which are very Indian sounding, which is peacock feathers and ivory and so on. So
I seem to remember in your book you have one of the Meluhans getting into a fight.
Yes.
And losing a tooth or breaking a tooth.
Yes, in fact, what happens is that these guys are Gujaratis and they are heading out. So do remember that Indians being in the Middle East is a very old thing. And they lived in large enough numbers. So the Sumerian texts mention these enclaves or villages outside of major Sumerian cities where there are these Indians or Meluhans coming to trade. And the very first mention of an Indian outside of the Indian subcontinent is of a court case, which you just mentioned, of where a Meluhan breaks the tooth of a local in a drunken brawl. And the judge tells him to pay a bunch of silver coins or something as compensation for doing this. Now, my theory is that this is the origin of prohibition in Gujarat. So anyway, these guys were sailing back and forth, and then something bad happens. And we now have very good evidence that a major drought happens around about 2000 BC, and happens over a period of a century and a half, where these repeated long droughts happen. And it destroys the Harappan civilization, but it causes damage to the old dynasty Egyptians, to the Sumerians, and to various others. And then the northwest of India essentially becomes dry. Now, I want to mention here, people tend to think of the Indic world and the Persianate world as being separate, largely because today the Balochistan area is very dry. But that's completely wrong, because until this 2000 BC event, Balochistan was grassland. So just like there were maritime routes, parallel along with it were actually terrestrial routes which went through Balochistan to the Persian area. And so this is a continuity of civilization that is there. So they should not be thought of as separate areas. So you see humped...
and Sam, you have, as recently as the 1940s, there was a Baluch port, which was Omani.
Yes,
is that right?
Gwadar.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is what is going on. But this world collapses, and suddenly there's no trade between these areas. But then what happens is the action moves to the other coast, to Odisha, what was then known as Kalinga. And in the Iron Age, so the Bronze Age collapse happens, and then the Iron Age reappears. And the action here seems to really bubble along the area we now know as the westernmost outlet of the Ganga, which is Hooghly, which is near Kolkata today, Bengal, and then goes through to Chilika Lake, which is a saltwater lake in Odisha. And that coastline suddenly becomes very active. And you have people going along the coast. And initially, they do not know how to cross the sea. They are still coastal. And they begin to settle things along the coast. So one group of them makes their way all the way to Sri Lanka. And they settle Sri Lanka. So interestingly, the culture of the majority population of Sri Lanka, which is the Sinhalese, is derived from Bengal and Odisha and not from nearby Tamil Nadu because of this maritime thing. And the same thing happens along the coast in the other direction, where they sail off towards, initially because, remember, they are doing the coastal route. So they're going along the Burma, and they go off to something called the Isthmus of Kra, which is the bit near Phuket from which Malaysia hangs off. So it's a part of Malaysia, the narrow bit. It's a part of Thailand, but then the Malay Peninsula hangs from it. And they would then walk across to the other side. It's just 20 kilometers or something. They go across, and then they would sail out towards the Mekong Delta and so on. And so the very first Indianized kingdoms that pop up in Southeast Asia don't happen to something that in a map would look very close, which is in Indonesia. And of course, everybody associates Indonesia with Indian culture, Bali, and so on. But in fact, it happens in southern Vietnam and Cambodia, where you have this beautiful story of how people turn up there, how an Indian merchant turned up there and was attacked by pirates and ends up having to beach his ship. And this chap called Kondinya, who is a Brahmin from somewhere in India, we don't know where, who goes there and he's captaining this ship. And he fights off the pirates, but then he beaches his ship and he's carrying out repairs when he gets surrounded by these local serpent tribe, Naga tribe. And it looks all hopeless. He's almost certainly going to get killed because now they are totally outnumbered. When the warrior princess of the Naga tribe, a lady called Soma, who sees him and falls in love and proposes marriage to him. Now, I am quite certain that he didn't have a very big choice in the matter. So he agrees, and they marry, and they set up an empire called the Empire of Funan. But what is interesting, now when does this happen? We don't know, but somewhere in the 4th, 5th century BC. But what is interesting is that subsequently, right into modern times, all royal lineages of that part of the world take their lineage back to that marriage. And it is a matrilineal...
the origin of the word Khmer, isn't it?
Yes.
Mir is from the princess.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this is how Indianization happens. Of course, much later, and I'm not going to monopolize this conversation. What happens, of course, is that the people in the Indian Ocean world discover the monsoons and discover that they don't have to be along the coast. Monsoons are very interesting things because they go in one direction. The winds blow in one direction for part of the year, and the other direction the rest of the year. So what happens, you can go and you can come back. So this dramatically makes it easier to...
And
trade.
fast, surprisingly fast.
Surprisingly fast. So what is happening is they're going back and forth, and so the trade routes change, and you begin to see people trading between the Roman Empire and the Kerala coast, for example, or the eastern coast of India and Indonesia, and you still have festivals called the Bali Yatra, which literally means the journey to Bali. And it's interesting when these festivals are even today celebrated. So, for example, in Orissa, it happens in something called Kartik Purnima. There's the full moon of Kartika, which happens in mid-November. And why does it happen mid-November? Because that is when the winds begin to blow from the north southward. And so that is when the merchants would set sail towards Bali. So hence, it's called Bali Jatra. Literally means the voyage to Bali. And so every year, this is still celebrated there.
Just before we hand over to Peter, do you want to just give a quick soupçon of what happens next with the Indianization and how we end up at Angkor? Just a quick
Yes,
gallop.
so there is all this trade going back and forth. So I want to make it very clear that, and this is why I said reading the histories of national histories of any one country is misleading. Because Indians try to project this is purely as Indianization. And yes, India being the dominant cultural power, much of the influence did go outwards. But there's plenty of influence coming inwards. For example, Indians love eating something called pan, betel nut and leaf. Now, neither the leaf nor the nut are Indian. They're actually Indonesian plants. And so we derived this custom from Indonesia, where it is now a very, very rural thing.
And rice and bananas.
Bananas, yes. Rice, there is a dispute, because there is an Indian varieties of rice as well. But bananas, yes, sugarcane. But that happened very much earlier, so that was probably a land route. Sugarcane moves about 10,000 years ago. But anyway, all of this is going on. Many of the famous dynasties of South India, for example, the Pallavas, derive their matrilineal lineage from either from Malaysia or from Cambodia. We don't know for sure. But it's interesting that although the male lineage call themselves the Pallavas and so on, all their origin myths start with a marriage to a Naga princess. And again, this serpent idea of a serpent dynasty providing the sort of royal lineage.
And the father-in-law, who's the serpent, then drains the land.
And does all these sorts of things.
And you suddenly get all the irrigation.
Yes, so now, if you want to see where does this idea of Naga come from, Naga, easily, just go to Angkor Wat, you will see the 7-headed cobra everywhere. That is the royal symbol. these are the Nagas, the Naga people. And this is why in the Naga, but remember in Indian languages, the Nagas are the oriental looking people. That's the Indian word for people who look oriental. Oriental as in the Southeast Asian Oriental. If you're looking Tibetan Oriental, then the word is Kirata. So you have to be dark and oriental looking is Naga. That's why Nagaland still uses a derivative of that idea to this day.
And just to conclude, so how come that we end up with Kurukshetra and the Ramayana sitting in the middle of Cambodia at the center of the largest Hindu temple ever built?
So what's going on is there's these legends. Of course, you're sailing out and you're taking ideas, cultural ideas out. But how did it literally happen is quite interesting. At least some part of it was like this. Of course, there were learned Brahmins, etc., who were very imported in from India by these courts. By the way, even to this day, the king of Thailand has to be crowned by a Brahmin from Gorakhpur. To this day. So the royal rituals are carried out by Hindu priests, even though it's a Buddhist country. But the way...
And links to Kanchipuram too. There's some Kanchi lineage.
Kanchi lineage, Gorakhpur lineage, various things are there. But what is interesting here is that all of this is happening, okay, at the high court level. But there is some of this happening at the folk level, which is not so much talked about. So let me give you a flavor of that. You see, throughout the eastern Indian Ocean, the Bay of Bengal area, there is a tradition of shadow puppetry. Right? You'll get this in Andhra Pradesh and Odisha, etc. But you will also see this in Indonesia, in Malaysia. And so where does this shadow puppetry come from? What's this all about? Well, imagine the following situation. You have these ships. These are wooden stitch ships. And there are these bored sailors sitting around with nothing to do. But you know, if you try to do anything, there's got these sails in the middle of the ship. So what do you do with it? So what happens is that you have the audience on one side of the sail, and the storyteller on the other side of the sail, and they use the sail as the way to show the shadow puppetry. It's movie night, exactly. It's movie night. So that is what
some prehistoric Shekhar Kapoor is there doing.
Yes, there's exactly. So you'll see this is what is going on. They've got a light, whatever, got a lamp going, and he's telling the epics to keep his movie night for his. And he's doing these things, and so that is how this tradition. So while I said the high Sanskritic culture, of course, will require priests and educated people, etc., dynasties floating around, the folk culture derives from the movement of these merchants.
Sanjeev, one last question before we hand over to Peter. We're sitting in the Maldives. Where do the Maldives fit into this whole story of navigation?
Cowrie shells. So the small change, so this is interesting. So these people are all trading. So how do they transact? So of course, one part of it, the big money is in gold and silver coins, which interestingly, a lot of it came from the Roman Empire. So one of the interesting things is that the Romans are continuously complaining that the Indians run a current account surplus with them and insist that the payment is made in gold. So there's this continuous flow of gold coins to the Indians and then onward to Southeast Asia and so on. And so if you go to archaeological sites across India, along the coast, you find lots of Roman coins. So this is one part of how payments are made. But the Maldives are the source of small change, which is the cowrie shells. So there's these small shells, which I suppose are quite common here. And the small change, and they were so used, you found Maldivian cowrie shells being traded all the way across to West Africa over periods of time. So they were traded well inland, you know, in places like Tibet and so on, where cowrie shells are found. But the Lakshadweep Islands, which is just north of here, and the Maldives were one of the major sources of cowrie shells.
Thank you so much, Sanjeev. Big round of applause, please, for Sanjeev Sanyal. Characteristically energetic performance. Peter.
Well, that's great. I mean, it's brilliant. I don't know what you'd like me to talk about. I mean,
You wrote a wonderful book, Peter, the Silk Roads.
I'd much rather talk about what Sanjeev is. I mean, I think that it is absolutely right that it's easy to overlook these kind of connections. I think there are two or three, I guess, obvious things. One is that it's easy to bring that story to an end in, I suppose, what one calls the Middle Ages and the end of the Chola and the end of Khmer Empire. And that feels like an end point. But, you know, India's footprint into the South Pacific carried on carries on today, but emigration in large numbers to places like Fiji in the 19th and 20th centuries is a hugely important part of the histories of the eastern part of the Indian Ocean and beyond to this day. Indian connections into East Africa, hugely significant into the modern era. So
that wonderful book, Crossing the Bay of Bengal, has that statistic. In the 1920s, more people are moving from southern India to Burma than are crossing from Europe to America.
Right. I mean, on a much bigger scale. So it's about 50 million people are on the move in the last 2 decades of the 19th century, primarily from India, but also from China. And the difference is most of the people who emigrate from the Indian and subcontinent come back within 1.5 generations. Right? There's a cycle that looks different to Chinese emigration in the same period for all sorts of different reasons. The genetic propensity against and resistance against things like malaria makes Indian workers, coerced, indentured, and otherwise, extremely valuable to capitalist systems of the industrial era. So I mean that makes a reason why Indians are transplanted to the Caribbean as well and to South America. So I think inserting that maritime world, it's hugely significant, and there's no question it's been overlooked for all sorts of reasons. Some to do with structural bias of academic curricula, partly to do with the languages that are required, partly to do with what you want to look at, and partly about what the story it is that you want to tell today. So I mean, for example, the population of Madagascar has a 98% DNA map with the population of the Malay Peninsula. Malagasy and Malay are, to all intents and purposes...
And these guys are crossing the open ocean very early on.
Yeah.
What's the period?
This is about, sorry.
800 AD.
Or earlier.
Or earlier.
Or earlier. In fact, we find first genetic imprints about 4,000 years ago. But the scale is also important. So one of the things that one has to do as an economic historian is to then slightly disaggregate quotes from Pliny about current account surplus, which clearly there is in a certain period, is what happens to that current account surplus for the following 700 or 800 years, which doesn't seem to exist. So you find a massive pulse of Roman coinage, most of it petty coinage, in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, but then a total decline. And one has to look at...
solid gold ori, too. You have 20,000...
it depends what you mean by
20,000 gold coins found in a single sandbank
as
in
luck would have
Kerala.
it, we have one of the world's preeminent classical historians in the audience, so maybe we can involve some of the others
Mary
to
Beard,
talk,
stand up.
to talk around that. I suppose
we need a woman out of this battle.
I suppose sort of going backwards into some of the things that we've talked about. One is around what is being traded, and almost all trade is local and intensive and highly localized. So people tend not to get in ships and take the monsoon where they're away from home for 12 months, however quick it might look, unless there are profits to be made, and unless you're able to bring things to different parts of the world that are needed. And typically those will be elite goods, which is why the label of the Silk Roads is problematic for all sorts of reasons, because it suggests long distance, it suggests small quantities of highly valuable, shiny things that catch the attention of historians that then write about, and forgets about the intensity of local exchange. So I guess my starting point would be, in the first instance, and it's, again, the economic historian in me, is you look for demographics, right? You look for population bases. And there you find, as Sanjeev said, Indus Valley, Mesopotamia, Yellow River, Mekong Delta, Nile. You look for regions that are environmentally prescribed, so they have high levels of resource availability, but on either sides, in uninhabitable space, mountains, deserts, and so on, that forces and accelerates processes of growth. And then the most obvious question to ask is, if you have rising populations through arrival of more people, demographic growth, improvements in medicine, and so on, the first and probably the only question to ask first is calorie consumption. Right? It's how do you feed people? And second, obviously, parallel to that, where does water come from? And in that sense, the Indian subcontinent looks different to other regions.
In what sense?
Well, it looks different for two primary reasons. First, the northern part of India is almost exclusively fed by Himalayan water sources. And because of that, the river patterns are constantly changing. That makes establishment of cities difficult. It makes the need to adapt and to be resilient extremely high. And it reduces levels of inequality. So Indus Valley civilizations are unusual compared to other types of developments around the same time of large
They
densities.
look quite equitable. The houses,
Well,
are
houses are
similar
about the same size. There's no obvious premium for being closer to water sources and food sources because you're constantly on the move. And even into the 17th and 18th centuries, you find constant references and mentions by European travelers, by Babur, about Ibn Battuta going backwards. You scale this all the time. In the northern half of India, you have pop-up cities that can suddenly become depopulated, can suddenly spring up.
Fatehpur Sikri
Right.
rises to, 2 million and then disappears overnight.
Right, and that speaks to a different way of
Which again is a water problem in Fatehpur Sikri.
well, it's a problem if you are an archaeologist and you like cities that you can take photos of and put on Instagram. It's not a problem if you want to retain economic, political, and cultural control. Then we prioritize people who live in cities and build castles and walls because we think we can see things that look familiar to us. But, relating to the steppe worlds, being mobile, which nomads are not mobile all the time, by the way. They have cities of their own. They're important permanent establishments, but as a way in which we write out people with oral traditions, the way we write out indigenous peoples, the way in which we sort of infantilize cultures that don't look like European cities. Right, and I think that is a real challenge. So northern India has a different profile, which is partly to do with geography, economics, etc., but also because there are connections into those steppe worlds that, in the demographic point of view, are absolutely crucial. You can't understand, I think, Indian history or the subcontinent history without understanding protein sources, and it's about food. So protein and textiles and dairy are why the steppes are so important. So the steppe worlds are the engine and driver for the formation of 85% of empires in world history. The steppes.
Sorry, you said steppe well.
The steppes.
Right,
the
right,
world
right,
of
right.
the steppes.
World
And there
of
are
the
lots
steppe.
of reasons for that. It's one reason, for example, why it has been, there are lots of periods of Indian history, lots of different dynasties, but India, the Indian subcontinent, and I choose quite carefully about how I try to use subcontinent versus India, but it's is that the process and the drive for what people like Peter Turchin call ultra-sociability doesn't exist in the Indian subcontinent in the same way that it does in Mesopotamia, in China, in Central Asia, even in Europe, where the drive to centralize, the drive to militarize, the vectors by which you have the primary competitive advantage, of course, the horse, but also the other sources that those steppe worlds provide, dairy, protein, textiles, leather, and so on, are in abundant supply. And in India, because it's more humid, because vegetation is different, because of water sources,
And because horses
it's
don't
not that there
survive.
aren't horses, but that's why Mongol and Central Asian
Horses
Timurid
decline
horses.
in the plains.
It gives a different profile. So it means that the Indian subcontinent inevitably will look outwards from its cities, outwards for its cultural influences and exports. As it happens, and it'd be interesting to talk about, most of the primary big Indian cities that are of interest to me in the periods that I look at are significantly inland. There are some that are on the coast, but the primary cities we think about as being high points of Indian culture, places like Gangai, Kondai, Cholapuram, are not far from the coast, but they're not on the coast. They're not Rome. They're not Constantinople. They're not Cairo. They're not places like Wuhan. They're not places like Shanghai. They're not places which is a tiny port, like Fudan. It's a different kind of profile, and it means that the ways in which Indian cultures and peoples interact with each other is different. And
With the Pallavas, the capital is.
Well, I actually have a
Kanchipuram,
slightly different view on the matter.
Go on.
First of all, actually, that's not quite true. There are fairly large settlements along the coast.
There are, yes.
So the problem is that the Indian coastline is actually very fluid.
Correct.
So the problem, many of the places that may have been great cities may have been washed away. I'll give you an example of Mahabalipuram. Mahabalipuram, actually, what you see today are the temples, are a very small fraction of the temples that historical documents suggest. Like, we know that there were many more such shore temples. And when the tsunami happened, when the waters went back, suddenly people were able to see some of these out at sea. The fact that they don't exist on land today is not to be suggested that they didn't exist.
No, of course that's right. And
It's interesting comparison, though, because in a sense, the Pallava capital was Kanchi.
Which is not far from the coast.
But it is a different thing.
No, so what has happened, if you look at the map...
Chidambaram or Nagapattinam and Tanjore.
So Kanchi is just a little bit inland. I mean, it's a half an hour drive from Chennai, so Chennai is on the coast. So, and Mahabalipuram is just south of Chennai. So they have a port and they have a capital.
Sure.
Same as Rome. I mean, Rome is also slightly in,
Yes, but sacred locations in the Indian subcontinent are typically not coastal. There are some.
There's quite a few.
But the Kumbh Mela is not a coastal event.
Kumbh Mela isn't, but for example, Somnath is on the coast.
Sure.
Konark is on the coast.
Yeah.
And also you have to understand, why are they on the coast? The richest temples are on the coast. The reason for that is that they function as banks. So the reason there's so much gold in these temples, particularly these coastal ones, is that the temples actually made their wealth, not because Indian politicians of the time were handing over their money to the temples, which, always difficult thing to get them to do, is because all these voyages I had just mentioned, except for the very, very early phase, is actually not done by these individual merchants setting sail. No, they were done by these corporatized guilds, which were like multinational companies.
Sure.
And they were funded.
With their own soldiers.
With their own soldiers, etc. So, sort of proto-East India Company kind of things. And many of them survived many dynasties, by the way. And they were feared by some of the kings because they were more powerful in some cases than the kings. But for our present purposes, the point is, why did Somnath have so much gold? It had gold because it was a bank. And all these, the venture capital of these voyages was provided by these temples. So it's a longer debate, maybe for another day, but I am not quite certain. Like, for example, Bombay has Elephanta. There was a large settlement in Elephanta.
Look, I probably phrased it wrong, but I think the point is not that there are none, and not that they're not significant, but the primary heartlands of what we think of as the cultural, social, military, political capitals are not primarily coastal. That's all. We can argue about the toss.
I think the difference is that you have a lot of coastal-dominated stuff in the earlier periods, and then when the time that you have the Mughal and Sultanate dominated, they're coming in from Central Asia, and it is places like Agra, Delhi,
well, so
Allahabad.
the question...
So I'm trying to say that's a change.
Yeah.
Like Tanjavur, which is the Chola capital, and later Gangai Cholapuram, are inland, but they're barely inland. I mean, now...
They're in the delta.
Yeah, they're in the delta, and it's a very short distance to their main port, which is Nagapatnam, for example.
But even the Chola capital moves from
it moves around.
to Tanjavur. It's the point of mobility is the point. Is
The queen of Indian Ocean Studies, Himanshu Prabarai's most recent book, is Coastal Shrines.
Right.
And she makes these fascinating points that you've got, that we tend to think because of our modern national boundaries, and we look at things from maps with India here, Indonesia there, that we're dealing with different countries at different... She's very strong on the idea of oceans as the binding force.
Sure.
And that you have, if you like, United States of the Indian Ocean. And therefore, when a Pallava temple is built at Mahabalipuram in the 6th century, an almost identical one appears in Gedong Songo
and
in Java.
they're cousins.
Yeah, and dozens of
No, not just that. They are the people who are building them are cousins, first cousins in some cases.
So I've got the two things that are most interesting to me, I think, I mean, it's obviously right. I mean, I started by completely agreeing about the importance of the maritime worlds. There's no question about that. I think the profile of when one then starts to look at it, about what's it sitting along, it's not either or. It has to be integrated. It has to be all together, and it can't be... We think of the maritime worlds because of the Royal Navy and the British trade and global, needs sea access. There's no question there's important regular trade. In terms of the longer distance, it's not just elite and goods. We have in Mesopotamian texts and Sumerian texts about wood being shipped from India, which is expensive. Yeah. It means that unsustainability. It means there are problems. But anyway, I think the two most interesting questions for me are, first, why is there no clear unity in the Indian subcontinent politically compared to Rome? And then there's the Grand Brèche, there's the big gap until Charlemagne, or till Europe then takes a different shape. But why do we not see the same pulse in the Indian subcontinent? Question one. I'd be great to hear your...
big empires.
Well, let's hear. I'd have a slightly different view, but it'd be great to hear what you both think. That's one. And the second one is the periodization. The danger when we look back hundreds of years or centuries is to kind of go, well, there's Rome and then there's the Middle Ages, and those are all quite close because it's people must have been wearing togas, or they spoke Latin, or they were sort of connected. But there was the 1,000-year gap between Pliny and the Chola Empire. So what is it that sparks, for example, the great expansion of Indian culture, including language, including Sanskrit, including Hinduism, and including Buddhism in the 7th century, but the really interesting pulse around about 900? Why does that Chola expansion happen to Southeast Asia, and why has it not happened before? That I think is the key, the timing question. It'd be great to hear what you both think.
So there's firstly, one important thing is that Indians always conceive themselves as a civilizational rather than a political nation. And this is very old. If you go back to the Puranas, then there are several Puranas, there are about 18 of them. Every single Purana, they are composed between 800 BC to the 2nd century AD. So they're over a 1,000-year period. But every single Purana has a section of the geography of India. And so they all start with something stating, south of the Himalayas and north of the oceans live the people who call themselves the Bharatas, or the sons of the Bharatas, something to that effect. Right. And then all of them have the description of the rivers, which always have the Sindhu, which is the Indus, and the rivers of South India, the Kaveri, Godavari, Ganga, Yamuna, etc. Some of them mentioned Brahmaputra. Interestingly, they all mention the Saraswati, which is dried up by this point that they're writing all this, about 1,000 years earlier. And they also mention all the mountains. So this idea that they had some cultural unity is a very old one. Now, why should this correlate with an idea of political nationhood? Well, the ancient Greeks had something similar. I mean, they fought with themselves all the time. But they'd also had a sense of a cultural nationhood in the sense when the Olympics happened, they all signed up, or the Persians turned up, they would unite. So the Indians have a similar conception. But they also have a conception of a universal monarch who conquers the entire thing, which comes up in the Mahabharata, for example, where you see the Mahabharata. The Chakravartin, the idea of the universal monarch who conquers in every direction. By the way, the Chakravartin idea, Chakra is literally the wheel, and the Chakravartin is he who has conquered lands in every direction. And so the Indian flag still has a Chakravartin in it. And there are many former sort of, let's say, ancient diasporas of India, like the Gypsies, which still use the wheel as their symbol. So the wheel as a symbol is a very important one. Unfortunately, since the 19th century, interpreted as a Buddhist symbol, it's got nothing to do with Buddhism. It has got to do with the idea of the universal monarch, which could be a spiritual monarch like Buddha, but originally is a very political idea of the Chakravartin. And he who does the Chakravartin, who becomes the Chakravartin, is then has the right to carry out the Ashwamedha Yagya, which is the horse sacrifice. So this idea of political unity is there, and it happens from time to time. So the Mauryans, for example, conquer everything from eastern Persia across to Bengal. They don't conquer the very southern tip of India, but they are aware of it. And you see, similarly, kings of various parts of India creating lineages linked to various other parts of the country. So, for example, the Mauryans conquered most of what is basically the subcontinent. 600 years later, the Guptas tried to do this.
But it doesn't last too long, right?
Well, it lasted three generations. Yeah. But let me also be careful here. While the Chinese, when we show the map of the Tang dynasty, we like to show that all the Tang dynasty at its peak. Well, if you look at the Guptas at their peak, they conquered the whole of the subcontinent as well. Samudragupta went down all the way to the southern tip of India and up.
Yeah, but it doesn't last.
It lasts six generations. It's not too bad.
Yes, but we're looking at, let's say, Persia. We're looking at
so this is a much larger landscape. Yeah. So China, in its current borders, has never existed. The Tibetans were always an empire that was threatening the Mings and so on. So current borders is not to be correlated by saying that this didn't exist. But an empire, so firstly, a cultural idea of India as a civilizational nation is old. Two, there were many attempts to create a political entity which lasts for a few generations sometimes, but there is always this ambition to do it. Because after all, even the Cholas, they did not consider the raiding of Southeast Asia, which is a militarily much more difficult thing to do, as their greatest achievement. They consider their greatest achievement is to have just reached the Ganga and come back.
Can I ask Sanjeev, how does Buddhism and minority religions fit into this conceptualization of a cultural identity in India that you're talking about, rather than just a Hindu Brahmin view? Or is that a problem?
So first of all, he's separating out Jainism and Buddhism particularly out of the Indic or dharmic religious thing is purely a 19th century idea which comes out of this idea that Buddhism is some sort of a Protestant Hinduism. This is actually a completely wrong view. If you read Buddha's own texts, the Tipitakas, he does not criticize the Brahmins at all. Please read it. They're a part of the milieu. The Hindus go to the Buddhist, even today you go to a traditional Buddhist place like Tibet, a Tibetan monastery, they worship Buddha, but they also worship Tara, which is a form of Durga. I also go to a temple, I worship Buddha. If I go to a Buddhist temple, I worship Buddha. It's not a separation.
One thing I think is very interesting if we're looking at Southeast Asia and its relationship with India is that so many of the myths which animate Southeast Asia...
So many what?
Of the myths.
Oh, yeah.
Which are, like the Ramayana, which is everywhere on shadow puppetry on the walls of the palaces in Laos and Vietnam and Thailand, the Garuda, the national airline, and so on. You have, in Angkor, all these myths dreamt up on the banks of the Yamuna. You have Kurukshetra, north of Delhi. You have all the stories of Krishna outside Vrindavan, and it's sitting in the Mekong, in the middle of Cambodia. What intrigues me is that while all these ideas are coming from India, you have, particularly under the Khmers, but also under the Sailendras and under Srivijaya, far larger polities at certain points in Southeast Asia with more resources. So Angkor is about 40 times the size of the largest Chola temple. And so while the ideas are coming from India, the fact that Indian polities remain basically fractured, and that with these very brief exceptions of 4 or 5 generations here or there, when you get an imperial thing, the Indian exceptionalism is its production of religions, philosophies, art forms, stories, mythologies, which other people go on and create on a much larger scale. So the largest Buddhist monument in the world is Borobudur. The largest Hindu monument in the world is Angkor Wat. And that while the ideas are coming from India, they reach, in a sense, their most elaborate flowering in Southeast Asia.
Not unusual. I mean, Christianity is Israeli religion, but St. Peter's Cathedral is certainly larger than anything in Israel. So the point of the...
Lutyens Delhi. Yeah,
Lutyens Delhi. So this is not an unusual phenomena. But also I would like to say that in the Indic view, which of course has a very strong Hindu element to it, but more widely the Indic view, is connected through in many other ways than you should think of a top-down, much more... So to use some mathematical terms, these are complex adaptive systems. So these are complex adaptive systems which are linked through in all kinds of different ways, which may not be linear. So just give you an example. I am a Shakta Hindu. I worship primarily female deities. My kind of Hinduism is actually much more closely linked in some ways to Tibetan Buddhism than it is to, say, some forms of Vaishnava Hinduism. Now, if I then begin to try and create these clear links, like this is Christianity and this is Protestantism and this is Islam in the Abrahamic framework, then there's a problem because this is not meaningful to my context. Sure. So the Indic traditions are all mix and match and messy, and we have all kinds of links, which may not, for example, even correlate, for example, with the political, for example, the resistance to foreign invasions, whether Islamic or later on European, is very often not done by the kings. It is done by these networks of akhadas, which I was talking about earlier. So these networks of akhadas, even today, by the way, in the Kumbh Mela, when the akhadas meet, they all go there with swords and so on. So what are they? They're actually military orders. And these military orders are, in some ways, the main source of resistance to... And they are
also collaborate. Himat Bahadur.
Yeah, so they collaborate, they fight, they all. So
joins the British. You could argue that the British are given in the 1803 Maratha War. It is Himat Bahadur going across to the British, which gives them the British.
Yeah, so there is a somewhat more complicated view of the world, which cannot be seen in these nicely, nice, clean institutions as seen from a Western perspective. Yeah. So I will, for example, feel perfectly comfortable going to a Thai Buddhist temple and know exactly what to do where without being told, because I know it, there's a Ganesh there, you will find Saraswati there. In fact, why? Thailand is close by. You can go to a Shinto temple in Japan, and I know exactly what to do where, because Shintoism, by the way, the word Shinto may be derived from Sindhu as well, clearly has links to Hinduism. And I feel completely, they do fire sacrifice.
The patriarch of Zen Buddhism, Bodhidharma, is meant to be Nepalava prince.
Yeah, so there can be all kinds of links. But they need not be seen in these nice compartments which exist, for example, in Abrahamic systems, where Christianity is clearly separate from Islam, which is clearly separate from Judaism.
Again, I think you can exaggerate that. There's a huge,
No, so there's a lot
when
of
the first Islamic armies come over the Middle East, people think they're Aryan heretics rather than, I mean, there are no clear boundaries in many cases.
Yeah, so that may be the better way.
Religion is porous.
This may be the easier way to think about how we thought about the world and continue to think about the world in many ways than maybe like, for example, Indians do not very often distinguish Nepalese as being non-Indian. It irritates Nepalese sometimes in a political sphere, but culturally they will feel that they are just us.
I'd like to ask Peter a question. One thing we haven't touched on, which is a huge, in a sense, the elephant in the room for ancient trade, is the Persian presence in Indian trade. Because there are various points when it seems that Persian fleets are when you have those Buddhist accounts of Yijing and Vajrabodhi, they're always catching on Persian boats, bushy boats they call them. And so there seems to be these large Persian fleets sailing up and down from the Persian Gulf as far as China, as far as the Mekong. You're our Persian man.
Yeah, I go into tutorial mode. There is some presence, but it's very small, and it's very easy to extrapolate from small communities of Persian settlers in western and on the eastern coast of China that there is intensive trade. I mean, there is clearly goods moving around the Belitung wreck and so on with 80,000 pieces of Chinese ceramics.
Vajrabodhi says he catches a fleet of 40 Persian vessels from Sri Lanka going to China.
But I mean, I think bouncing slightly off again what you've just been saying, Sanjeev and Willie, is that what's interesting is that dominant Hindu presence into Southeast Asia that you see in this flashpoint window, you don't see in the Western Indian Ocean. Obviously, there's trade. Obviously, there are people. There's movement, but there's no grip. There are communities that build temples in Persia, even on the Swahili coast in places like Kilwa, but they're small and they're kept alive by small communities, a bit like mosques in eastern China. And it's interesting, I think, why is it that Hinduism can catch fire eastwards but won't westwards? Likewise, why is it that Buddhism doesn't make an impression, despite the few borrowings and the obvious bits and pieces? India, again, I've written in my new book, hugely undervalued in looking at rabbinic traditions and Jewish traditions. The dominance of Indian animals and goods and so on in the Torah, always overlooked because we think of Judaism as a Mediterranean
Frederick II,
religion.
Stupo Mundi, asks Michael Scott, the wizard in Sicily, is there any link between the cult of the red heifer and the Torah and Indian religions?
So all these connections, but even things like Buddhism makes some impression, of course, in the Indian subcontinent, but its primary win is Central Asia and China. It's all about land routes. It's all about syncretism then into Southeast Asia. But Buddhism, likewise, doesn't make any particular impression, apart from a few loan words, borrowings, visual symbols, in Zoroastrianism, in Christianity further westwards. And that, I think, is really interesting about why are these two hemispheres? And you've written about this in your book, Sanjeev, about the Arab or Persianate circle, the Indian circle, the Chinese circle, these overlapping Venn diagrams. And the first point, I guess, is that these circles are always on the move, and sometimes they're overlapping intensively, and sometimes they're not. And I think the job of a historian is to try to work out, not just to define them, which we'll all agree on, but it's where are those pinch points? What is it that happens that allows Angkor to flourish and boom and become 40 times greater in size, but then those collapses? What is it that makes that happen? And those can be easy to overlook because we're looking for identities, we're looking for connectivities, and of course we focus on the Technicolor Second World War, we focus on the kind of big Second World War moment that draws us all in for all sorts of reasons. They're more material, they're sources, etc. But I think that those waves and those pulses are hugely significant to try to fit into with some kind of context. For what it's worth, as a kind of sign-off, because I'm sure we maybe have a couple of questions, I do think there's a lot to do with Victor Lieberman's idea about parallel empires. These places are not rising on their own. It's not about a dynasty local in Indian subcontinent or in Angkor. It's about seeing the huge hinterlander connections that are both maritime and land-based. And in fact, the thing that's really interesting that we won't talk about now, with Harappan civilizations, with Mesopotamia, is that, but hugely significant in today's world, is one chink gets removed from that tower, and the globalized networks fall down, right? The bullwhip effect, it's called by economists. It's that a single point of failure, and it's, I suppose, a bit like driving a car. The car never breaks. It's one wing nut that costs 50p that comes off your car when you're doing 50 miles an hour, or 80 miles an hour, whatever you're doing on the motorway, maybe 80 miles an hour. And that 50p thing makes the car unusable. And that, I think, is a symbol for our times today of a world that is in a decade of uncertainty crisis. And I think that there are very natural parallels about thinking about how that heavily Hindu world of Southeast Asia both rose, but also how did it didn't fall, but it melted. And the question is, why was there the melt? Why was it that there was overlaying, replacement, Buddhism, the syncretism where you can be comfortable in a Thai temple because there are borrowings? Why is there the constant, the new felt tip pens coming in over the top? And how do we learn from that? And in our cosmopolitan world today, where we struggle with ideas about national identities and an insistent dominant narrative that is often ethnic, often religious, often cultural, that demands a view of the past, I think that nuance can be very easily lost. And historians, we don't have the most difficult job in the world, even though writing a book is a nightmare. But I think we have a responsibility to be trying to look at those ways in which we can grade those and take readers and non-specialists through that process of trying to think about what questions we should be asking.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's as good a conclusion as we could possibly ever manage. Please, a big round of applause for Peter Frankopan and Sanjeev Sanyal. We have got some questions. I'd like to ask the first to Mary. Mary, the question that Peter threw in your direction, how important to the Roman world, particularly in the peak of the trade in the 1st, 2nd century, do you think India was and the Indian economy was?
Well, you can make it look very important, and you can say, well, you go and see the route across Egypt for spices, for example, and in some ways kind of what appears to be massive trade. I mean, the question then is the question of reach, isn't it? That you can, how far, if you're thinking of the population of the Roman Empire as a whole, how far does this, does it get to Roman Britain? Well, a bit of pepper.
Gambo with his 2 denarii of pepper on Vindolanda.
That's it. I mean, it does a bit, and it is mediated through the army. And so I think in one way, isn't it the case, and I'm speaking from memory now, and one of you will correct me, that there are Indian museums currently hold more locally found Roman coins than any other museums in the world apart from those in Italy. And so at some level it's big. Would the Roman Empire have looked different without it? That's a tricky question.
Thank you so much. Any questions? Shekhar. Is this about shadow puppetry, or?
It's about absolutely. History is shadow puppetry. Let's start there. Ever since I was born here, and I've been asking myself, what is India? You raised this question, who are we? And the only thing I came across is, we're a great story. So all of history to me is storytelling. If we are sitting here a century later, we'll tell a different story of history. I was writing a series on Cleopatra, and I came across that Antony and Cleopatra had dreamt about the next empire in India, because they had somebody who told them a great story about India. So what comes first, conquest or the story of what you're going to conquer? So is it the expansion of stories? I'm a filmmaker, so I go that way. It's the expansion of stories that came before conquest. It's the expansion of stories that came before merchanting. Why did these guys get up and go? Because they heard a story, but...
And certainly when you go to Angkor, you see all these Indian stories on the wall.
The Mahabharata is must have been 1 million different stories. So what happens is when we go down to the Gutenberg press and somebody says, well, you can't tell 1 million stories. There's a technology you can publish. Then we come to one story. That one story becomes the story. That the story becomes our history. Our history becomes a myth. The myth turns to fate. Fate turns to war. But it's still the seed of storytelling. So I think one day we need to start and say, why are we telling the stories, or is it important? It's the stories that spread before anything else.
Thank you. Thank you. Christina.
Thank you. I was going to ask Peter what he thought about air fryers, but I might ask something else.
Will you explain that joke? It's an important reference. Cultural reference for our time.
I'm sure Peter won't mind me telling everybody that the reason he's number 2 in the bestseller list is because people are much more interested, apparently, in air fryers than they are.
Worse, I knocked one of the air fryer books off. I don't know what an air fryer is.
It's some sort of modern barbecue.
But I came second. I knocked it off the top spot the next week. But a different book about air fryers then went to number 1.
Published by your publishers.
By our publishers.
Now I'm curious, what is it?
Don't you dare buy the book.
But I had a serious question. So you ended, Peter, talking about bringing it up to the modern day, and I wanted to ask both of you about modern day expansionism. You mentioned Gwadar earlier, the port in Baluchistan, in what is today Pakistan, which of course is now owned by the Chinese and is part of the Belt and Road Initiative.
In the 1940s was owned by Oman.
No, up to 1965 or something like that, by Oman.
We all saw arriving at the airport here, the big gleaming new airport that the Chinese are building in Mali. So I wanted to ask you about that Belt and Road Initiative. Is that a modern-day version of the Silk Road? Is it primarily about trade, or is it something that we should find more threatening?
Well, it depends what you mean, and it depends a bit like Mary. It depends what you want to see. So Belt and Road was an initiative announced in 2013 by Xi Jinping, but was a continuation of a series of Chinese policies, foreign and economic policies that dated back about 2 decades. But he put a new stamp on it and wrote it in the constitution of the Chinese Communist Party. So it's now a formal part of how China sees the world. And I suppose it is about telling a story. That's what China's trying to do of connectivities. It was launched in central Kazakhstan with a speech by Xi Jinping saying, we've all got on together, these Silk Roads have bound us together. There's a kind of narrative we can all buy into. And although Silk
Always
Road
appears when the Persians and the Chinese meet. There's huge talk about ancient links.
Well, so the Silk Road is a very clumsy label, like Europe is. It means something, it means nothing. It's easy to pick apart. But it's a very convenient layer. If you're Iranian, if you're Central Asian, if you're from Uzbekistan, from Samarkand, the Silk Road feels like it's your history. It feels that it's something that connects. And the Chinese, when they say we are not, which they do a lot in Africa, we're not going to cart you off in chains like the Europeans did, that there is something in that. All the exaggerations about how Zheng He traveled and what he was trying to do, it's all a kind of myth, really. But it is compelling compared to the East India Company, compared to what others did. So there is a narrative that China is trying to explain to the world. I mean, for what it's worth, Belt and Road, its primary worry was about leveraging of debt onto developing countries. More or less, Belt and Road funding stopped in the second half of 2018. There's been very little since then. We caught on to the idea that this might be a risk around about 2 years after that. It got written about a lot. The Chinese, if you disaggregate the Belt and Road beyond the kind of big label and wrapper, and I won't make this too long, but it's a little bit more to come, I'm afraid. There's a whole series of things that fit within it. There's a Silk Road oral hygiene program. There's a Silk Road into outer space, it's called. So everything has got the stamp on it because that's what they think the boss wants to see or wanted to see. Some of the things
we should just say here that Xi Jinping has read Peter's book.
Yes.
Which is not many of us can claim.
He's the source of this problem.
Luckily he spoke before my book came out. But there are obviously key areas of Chinese strategic thinking that are deeply embedded into what it looks like. So building a light railway system connecting a city in Kazakhstan looks to me unthreatening. Investment into Gwadar, which it's splitting hairs. They don't own, but they take 85% of the revenues and have a long-term lease on. Or likewise at Hambantota in Sri Lanka, can be a threat if you want to. What the Chinese will point out is that there are tens of thousands of US bases around the world, hundreds of thousands of US servicemen deployed. So isn't that what a global power looks like? So I think picking out which bits matter, which bits are dangerous, but we have, I'm sure you'll know them, a friend or acquaintance who's finance minister in one of the West African states, who over COVID spoke to me and said, I'm fed up with people from the State Department or the Foreign Office turning up and telling me not to borrow Chinese money, that just because I'm black, it looks like I can't operate a spreadsheet. I've got an MBA from Harvard, so I think I can be the judge of whether this will be a successful project or not. But second, we would love it if you could invest into our infrastructure of hospitals, schools, desalination, clean energy. But you won't. Africa as a whole has had 1% of investment into clean energy, even though it's the region of the continent. It's a clumsy, why should we look at Africa as a single entity anyway? But gets nothing. And then when COVID happened and we furloughed everyone, put them at home, and he went ballistic and said, so you can produce money whenever you want. We had in a session yesterday, it was very uncomfortable being said, well, you're only worried about Ukraine because it's women on Europe's back door, rather than this is what's happening to women globally. There is an idea in many parts of the world that we've over-prioritized aid into Ukraine. So Putin spoke about this in his speech 3 months ago. He said, look, the United States has put $170 billion into Ukraine in 6 months, and the US has put $40 billion into the developing world. And that was aimed not at people in the West, not at people, but at people who are being aimed at by China, by Russia, by people saying there is another alternative where white people are dangerous and self-interested. And that Chinese story is a complicated and difficult one that we need to work out where do we fit. So the Chinese have studied our history and they went to build a global empire, look at Britain, you need to have ports, you need to have a navy that can do blue water, green water and grey water, and we need to have capacity to do that, and being stopped from doing that is a threat to us. So Belt and Road, in a nutshell, as a final sign-off, it's not quite what it looks like, but the key areas where it is are ones that require investment on our side. They require us to put our money where our mouth is in terms of defense, foreign policy. You'll seen Gochin in Afghanistan 10 days ago announcing a $10 billion project to build hydroelectric dams, roads, water resources and so on. Whether that comes out or not is a difficult question. The Chinese state is a difficult actor to get into bed with. They're left in Hambantota with a port, in my view, is militarily and commercially a stone around their neck. I can't see any particular value. Gwadar is slightly different. Gwadar plays a role that if China is cut off in the South China Sea and East China Sea, there is some sea access. It's a long way from home. It's a complicated road. The Balochis have killed Chinese that have really startled everybody. So the Chinese are militarizing that corridor. And at a time when, Pakistan very well has IMF defaults, will give the Chinese the option of squeezing like the British did in India. And I think it'll be very hard for the Chinese to resist it.
Can I take that question to Sanjeev? So if the Belt and Road is an attempt to militarize and monetarize the Silk Road
in some
history,
parts, in some regions,
can you say that the Quad is the Chola Empire redux, or maybe the merchant guilds reawakened?
So let me actually answer the first question and then I'll come to yours. I think the interesting thing is that it's great that the Chinese are reading everybody else's history, but it's worth us reading their history.
Correct.
About their last attempt to do the Belt and Road, which was Admiral Zheng He. So the most important thing to remember about Admiral Zheng He, who, by the way, was a eunuch Mongol admiral.
Muslim, not Mongol, Muslim. Muslim.
Well, he was of Mongol origin. Anyway, doesn't matter. He was a eunuch admiral who then took these 7 great voyages between 14-something and 1433. The last one was 1433.
1405, yeah.
1405 to 1433. He took these great voyages, and the important thing about them is that they are projections of power. So do remember, by the 1400s, these routes are very well known.
In very big ships.
In these enormous ships called, essentially, the treasure fleet, the treasure ships. Now, the treasure ships the size of these ships was enormous. I mean, ships of this scale would not be built till into the 20th century. So these were huge ships. They come through Southeast Asia, into the Indian Ocean, and they visit, of course, the Indonesians, they visit Sri Lanka, India, Africa, Arabia, and so on. And they do trade, but they also do all kinds of geopolitical things. For example, they attempt to change the ruler of Sri Lanka and so on.
Kidnap him, don't they?
They kidnap him. They push back against the Majapahit of Indonesia, and they do various things. Now, what is interesting is that if you were sitting around in 1450 or something, and you would say that, the Chinese are going to dominate the world. What happened to these chaps? What happens is that the Ming emperor dies, and the new Ming emperor comes to the throne, and he's backed by the Confucian mandarins, the bureaucrats. And they don't like the eunuchs. and the eunuchs
It's
control...
always the civil servants, Sanjeev.
Yeah.
They always mess things up.
Absolutely. So the eunuchs control the navy, and the mandarins don't like the eunuchs. So basically what they do is what all civil servants would do under circumstances is switch off the money. And so the Chinese navy is never defeated. It's basically rots in the port. And the records of these great voyages are actually suppressed to an extent that it's only in the 20th century that we fully discover the scale of this. And yeah, all kinds of things, it's completely suppressed. Now, the main lesson of history, therefore, is be very afraid of bureaucrats. And...
Including you.
Yeah.
Particularly, Sanjeev.
Well, I'm not quite a bureaucrat. I'm a technocrat.
Close
I'm a
off
civil
the
servant.
funding.
I'm a civil servant, yes, but I'm a technocrat, not a bureaucrat. Okay. So, but anyway, the point is that one of the things that the Chinese do is, of course, they knock out all the other possible powers in the region, including the Majapahit, who would have been the natural inheritors of the Indian Ocean. And so, in 1496, I think, Vasco da Gama turns up in the Indian Ocean, and the Chinese have wiped out everybody and walked off. So, you know, the point about history is one of unintended consequences. The unintended consequence of Chinese expansionism was the Portuguese domination of the Indian Ocean. And so this could happen again. The Chinese could build and road and do all these things and disappear, and then it's the Kiwis who take over the world. And so I've always been very suspicious.
Be a friend of Jacinda Ardern has got a secret plan to come back.
Yes, so I have always told all my
Australian...
That's why I keep telling my Australian friends to keep a very close eye on the Kiwis who I don't trust at all. So...
Now Tej wanted to ask something.
Yeah, thank you.
Are we able, we're happy to extend? Yep.
Yeah, thank you, William. It's not so much a question, but a follow-up on the last question on the Belt and Road Initiative and Peter's answer in particular. I think there's a danger of here getting too much into the story and not the motive behind the story. Because, you know, stories, as all of you are story writers, can say a story can start from here or start from here and end somewhere else. The second important thing, and this is something, you know, partly in response to what...
ran the Ministry of External Affairs, which I said before.
What Sanjeev said is that I think you have to see this question in a certain time zone. I'm not bothered what happens to the Belt and Road Initiative 200 years from now. I'm bothered what happens in the next 20 years. I'm not bothered what it looks like from London or Washington or Geneva. I'm bothered what it looks from in India, and particularly what it looks from sitting in the Maldives. So I'm just finishing the point. I think, yes, the narrative that they have woven is important from their point of view. And obviously it has sunk home because there are about 160 countries, I forget the exact figure, somewhere in that range, who have signed on to the BRI. India has not, and for a particular reason. Because where we sit, this is not about trade, this is not about connectivity, this is a naked show of power, a naked move to take over the essential sovereignty of countries, and it's there on paper for everybody to see. Look at what happens to this country, look at what happens to Sri Lanka, what's happening to Bangladesh, what's happening to Nepal, and don't even bother about Pakistan. You know, a few Baluchis killing a few Chinese is not significant. What is significant is that Gwadar itself is 25% of Pakistan's GDP owned by a Chinese company. And besides, it goes through what India considers very much its own territory. So, you know, it all depends from where you look upon it. If it's all right for a country in Africa to get a good project and forget about it and let the next generation handle it. But for some countries, it's not. So I would be less generous on this.
Now, did you worried about the string of pearls? These ports?
Of course I am.
What are the other ones?
Djibouti.
No, there's Djibouti, there's
There's the Bab el Mandab port. There is Gwadar. There is in
Just explain, in case anyone here doesn't know what it is and what it means for India.
Well, what it means from India is that Chinese Navy has not been so much present in the Indian Ocean so far. I mean, this is one area which we have thought is possibly the preserve of the Indian Navy and along with the navies of, the United States, etc. And that is partly the thing for Quad. But what has happened today is that the Chinese are making submarines and
Aircraft
carriers faster than the United States.
Yeah. It's already a bigger fleet than the United States Navy. Yeah.
And so they are getting a proper blue water navy, and they are getting all these ports. They may not use Hambantota today. What they will do in 5 years, we don't know.
Now, Tej, do you think India's
Gwadar has zero
underrated
commercial
the
value.
threat from
Sorry?
China? Do you think India's underrated the threat from China?
No, I don't think we have. I don't think we have. I think anybody who knows anything about our defense and foreign affairs policy knows that, China is today threat number one. And we may or may not provoke them or, punch them in the eye at every Quad meeting. But that's our way of dealing with it because we are the only country which has a land conflict with China in the Quad, So that is why our position, nobody is going to come to India's assistance if there's a land conflict. So we have to balance how we engage with China.
Do you think Arunachal is an imminent issue?
No, that I don't know. But certainly...
For all it's worth, Tanzan Sen, who's probably the number one Indian academic within China in NYU Shanghai, believes that there is reason to be very worried about Arunachal and Chinese intelligence.
Well, we have seen a very close engagement and not a very nice one over the last few years on the LAC all along. Yeah.
Well, the key risk to India is water. That's the much more important
because that's a new one. That's a new one, and they once you get us these string of pearls and these things, and you have a huge Chinese Navy presence in the Indian Ocean, then the game changes.
But Himalayan water is much more of a risk to India than, it's not to say that the string of pearls is not a risk, but I would benchmark that much higher. I'll just have three quick responses. Okay.
No, so this combines with William's earlier point about the Quad. I have to be a little careful what I say because there I'm not a historian but a participant. But the thing is, it is absolutely right what Navtej is saying, that we are extremely concerned about this. Yeah. We have systematically kept out many Chinese initiatives. For example, of course, he talked about the BRI.
You're part of the Shanghai Corporation.
Yes, we are a part of some things. But when it comes to signing hard deals, we are much more careful. Like, for example, we kept out also of the RCEP. This is a regional economic...
It's the biggest free trade area.
It's a free trade area. Yep. We have a free trade agreement with pretty much everybody other than China in RCEP. And there was a big controversy when India decided to keep out of it. Many people said, India is becoming isolationist and so on. Absolutely not. We immediately afterwards signed a free trade agreement with Australia and with the UAE and maybe very shortly with the UK. So it's not that we are becoming isolationist. We, however, don't see the purpose of being inside the cage with the tiger. So, we are careful about this. We will not be the first to start the fight, but we have to be prepared that China may begin to do things which are not... and an important lesson of history is, do not try to logically work out why people may do what they do.
Well, let me tell you what China is doing.
Yeah.
Right. I can't speak with such distinguished practitioners from how it looks from Delhi and the risks and the threats. I will never underrate or underplay, or let alone be generous. But China has three very specific policies. Not telling a story, the Belt and Road. Number one is to detach every country in the world that has any kind of relationship with Taiwan. And over the last 6 years, it's done that extremely successfully, taking down from something like 31 down to something like 9. And that's aggressive, it's complicated, but China has a plan of what it wants to do, and there are all sorts of ways in which we could intervene as Indians, as Europeans, as Americans, but we haven't. Those have chipped away one by one. If you were the equivalent of who you are in Beijing, that would be your target. How do you make that happen? Right, for lots of different reasons. And that has been...
And they're very successful at doing it.
Has been ongoing and so on. We've woken up to that too late. the second one, without any question, is China has total critical weakness, of which in some cases there's a similarity with India, above its energy and above its food, right? And those are the two key areas where China has tried to address in Iran, a theocratic state that has no parallels at all with the Communist Party of China, Saudi Arabia. I definitely don't want the questions broadcast on the YouTube channel, but highly corrupt, autocratic, authoritarian, semi-aristocratic elite. It is, in real time. Well, let's... Okay. Of which there's no parallel if you're a Marxist-Leninist state to want to do deals with. But the need for China to make sure that it has the resilience until it can get to some kind of clean energy is a source of profound anxiety to China that it might get cut off. Its demographics is a long-term problem in the next 20, 30 years. Climate, absolutely critical with India's point of view, understanding the Himalayan systems, where yesterday the report was produced by the UN saying we're going to go through 1.5 degrees by 2027. All the glaciers in Tajikistan will have melted at least by 2050, I suspect slightly earlier than that. There are 650 HEP hydroelectric power projects either planned or being built, where India's exposure, already 1 billion people sit exposed, 230 million in India, 1 billion sit exposed to water shortage from the Himalayas, and that can be weaponized, that can be used as a tool, that can be used as leverage, and the
Himalayan glaciers, even without China's intervention.
No, that is a crisis that India will face regardless of what China does. China will make it worse, right? No question, because it has its own interests at stake. The third one is critical materials and critical energies, that China has made a plan of what it thinks it needs in the next 30, 40 years, up to 2049. And plans, as anybody who's ever written an essay at university, are often a really bad thing to do, because you end up knowing what your answer is. We listened to these wonderful novelists 2 days ago who don't have a plan when they start writing. That can be a way of producing great creativity. Locking something in and going for it is difficult. But that explains China's cobalt interests, the security stuff that it's doing. There are clear agendas. Speaking as a Brit, and I'm not here to knock our government because they can do that themselves, but it's not clear to us in Europe what it is that Europe means. You know, the Quad was cancelled last night, the meeting. I know Modi's going to go to Canberra, but the Quad meeting cancelled because there wasn't enough of agenda to talk about, right? Cancelled, but he's going to still go to Canberra, right? So that tells us something about, we understand what China's doing with its chess pieces, and it looks highly aggressive, usually correctly. Sometimes there are different ways of looking at it. They're making their moves. We do not have an obvious plan for what it is that our place in the world, forget about what we think China's place or India's place or the United States is, what does the future look like? And it would seem to me if I was in your positions, had access into the mainframe, I would be trying to ask the same kind, I'd probably come up with different answers, but I would be asking the same kinds of questions of what do we need for the UK to be solvent and successful, or Europe, in the next 30, 40 years? Where are our critical points of weakness? How do we provide resilience against changing disease environments, climatic changes, migration, food shortages, the kinds of things that you would expect to see in a warming world? And in fact, Sanjeev talked about that with Harappa, this breach point about 4,000 years ago. When things go wrong, the level of exposure is directly proportional to the scale of population size and population densities. And that is a major challenge for you in India with, you know, some of the larger cities in the world, some of the most densely polluted cities in the world, some of the less access to water, and that water stress is, how do you solve that problem? And I would spend a lot of time trying to deal with that, because the Chinese are equally, maybe more anxious, and will take water supply from India because that's what they think they need.
How long have the Himalayan glaciers got? Current estimates?
There are all kinds of estimates. These are complex adaptive systems. These things can happen much faster than you think, and they can take longer, or something completely different could happen. If you mess around with climate models, one of the things that you realize is that too much of the conversation tends to happen in very linear formats. Actually, these things, once you tip the system off, all kinds of strange things can happen. You can get 20 years of more rain, actually it becomes cooler before it swings around the other way. So once you've tipped this wobbly system, it can go all over the place. So I don't think we are wasting time trying to predict what will happen. Once you've knocked it over, it's knocked over. And we probably have done it already. So now that the system is knocked over, we now need to begin to adapt. So therefore, and going back to the point, if you look at ancient Indian legends, they are continuously about rivers disappearing, reappearing, settlements moving around, and so on. Yep. And the reason this happens is because the landscape is very, very volatile. By the way, Chinese history is also full of this.
Yes, yeah, it's the river of sorrow, the Yellow River.
So there are all kinds of things going on. And we are going to see this happening in this century. Now the question is, how do you handle it? Are you economically and socially, by the way, there's a huge political and social impact, not just economic impact. And keeping the world going in through all of this is going to be very, very tough. And if you're going to also go to war over something like Taiwan, this is not going to make it easier.
And I'll just add one final comment. In that, the Indian subcontinent, unfortunately not all Indians are born equal, because there's going to be more rainfall in southwestern India because of how the different weather systems of the eastern part of the Indian Ocean, the western part work, will produce higher levels of precipitation, which is good for calorie consumption. But in Kerala, and particularly in Kerala, but all of southern India, which is highly heat exposed, but will be okay. But northern India is a point of
So, you know, if you look at the models there, actually give all kinds of outcomes. So I'm just warning you against trying to be very clear what will happen. For example, one of the outcomes of that situation is that India switches to having much heavier rain in the winter from western disturbances because the system moves away. So yes, the monsoons weaken, but the western disturbances become stronger. So you get significant rain, but winter rains. So, and this has happened in the past. So just to give you an example, even our festivals have this in our memory.
Yeah, but the past is a bad predictor. When
I'm just telling you that, yeah, so what I'm trying to tell you is that complex adaptive models are very wobbly and they lead to all kinds of strange outcomes. I'm just telling you, there are combinations of outcomes that happen. What you're saying is a possibility. What I'm saying is another possibility. A third thing may happen.
On that positive note, thank you so much. This is why I feel it's worth doing this kind of discussion, to put two raging intellectual bulls in the same bull ring and let them get on with it is one of the great pleasures of a festival like Jaipur. Thank you so much, both of you. Amazing performance.